Welcome back, AP Psychers. In today's video, we are going to start a short series that overviews each of the psychological approaches to psychology. These were the color-coded columns in the back of the class. The 6 color-coded columns starting with cognitive, behavioral, biological, evolutionary, humanist, and then finally all the way to the right, psychoanalytic. I know sometimes these terms can be confusing. There are certain elements of questions that you've seen over the years where you can easily confuse one with the other. And I'm hoping by going through each of them briefly, we can really consolidate our understanding of each of them. I think it's reasonable to expect a type of bullet that we haven't really practiced, but I'm certainly going to expose you to, where the College Board provides you with a scenario, and they ask you how a psychologist practicing each of the approaches might deal with or evaluate what they might even study in the first place. So we're going to start with cognitive, which was the name of our first unit, cognitive psychology. All the way to the left, I have key topics, meaning what they study, what a cognitive psychologist would study. The first big topic from that unit was memory. So whether that's the limit of short-term memory, whether that's just the encoding, storage, retrieval process, whether that's all of the various things that influence memory, like Elizabeth Loftus's study on the misinformation effect. They might study decision-making. So, for example, the availability and the representativeness heuristic were examples of decision-making shortcuts that fall under the topic of cognition. Problem solving was another huge one from that unit. That's when we talked about algorithms and heuristic approaches. We talked about obstacles like confirmation bias, mental set, etc. Another major topic in this is creativity. That was the essential task when we broke down divergent and convergent thinking. Language is another massive topic, whether that's the study of language the way that Noam Chomsky studied language with the innate language acquisition device, or whether that's just phonemes and morphemes and trying to understand grammar and syntax. These are some of the major topics from Unit 1 that a cognitive psychologist would study. So, for example, if you were given a question, a psychologist shows up to a daycare, what would a cognitive psychologist study? What would they observe? What would they look for? A cognitive psychologist would question, why do children make certain decisions when deciding what toys to play with? When a child is posed some type of problem, what goes into their problem solving? They would look for examples of creativity. They would certainly be interested in seeing language development, similar to the critical period discussions that we had back in Unit 1, or certainly just memory as a whole. That topic can be studied at really any age. So a cognitive psychologist under that scenario would look for these types of topics. Some key psychologists, I don't envision names being super important on this year's AP exam. In theory, if you quickly search your name, or search a name in your notes, or search a name on Google, you'll quickly be able to find what they did, so I don't anticipate there being too many questions. But just in case, I'll throw a couple because this unit didn't have a lot. A gentleman by the name of George Miller is often considered the father of cognitive psychology. He was responsible for doing the study on short-term memory and found the number 7 as the limit to our short-term memory. So he gets a key psychologist icon back from that unit. I mentioned Elizabeth Loftus a few moments ago. She was the individual who conducted the study where she dubbed what was called the misinformation effect, where if you give an individual misleading information, will they incorporate that into their memory and thus taint that memory? Our friend Noam Chomsky is responsible for evaluating the innate language acquisition device, the belief that language is an innate skill. These are some of the key psychologists back from Unit 1. Going forward, these names I do not envision on the AP exam, but I like to point them out because I think they're useful to see again. If you remember our old friends Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, they were therapists who were classified as cognitive therapists, although I know they've eliminated the therapy unit and the clinical psychology unit from the AP exam. I think it's useful to think back and look at these two names again, because what was their therapy all about? Well, whether it was CBT or REBT, they were both about identifying cognitive distortions, illogical thoughts in the patient, and then trying to work with the patient to restructure, through cognitive restructuring, to fix those cognitive distortions and replace them with more logical thoughts. That's all about the thinking process. If you go back here and look at key topics, each and every single one of the topics listed all falls under the umbrella of thinking. Many of you made the connection back in Unit 1 really well. But when you see cognition, the word that you should quickly think of is thinking. We have our old friend Mr. Thinker sitting out here in the corner. There's a reason he's extended out and appearing here in the corner. That mnemonic worked back then. It will work going forward. One thing that's really critically important, and I will make this point evident when we get into psychoanalytic, is one thing that cognition is not, is a study of the unconscious. If you see any question with the word unconscious, this is not connected in any way, shape, or form to cognitive psychology. Only one field, only one approach studies the unconscious. That's the psychoanalytic approach, Freud's approach. So never use the word unconscious when evaluating a question. I know there's no multiple choice this year, but had it been, never in multiple choice. And if you get a question and it asks, what might a cognitive psychologist focus on or study in this given scenario? You will never reference the word unconscious. Pick some of these go-to words. They'll look for topics regarding memory. They'll study decision-making. They will study problem-solving. They will look for divergent and convergent thinking, exemplifying creativity. They'll study language acquisition or elements of language. As a whole, they will study something about thinking, something that's not observable, something that's just happening in your head. Language acquisition, decision-making, problem-solving, that's all stuff that's happening in the head, which we classify as cognition.